everyone. I want to take a brief look at the Module 3 study questions, especially the first two questions. I don't think that, to be quite frank, that there are any obviously correct answers from the readings that I've given you. The problem with reading Heidegger is that it's difficult to read Heidegger. It's in translation. But Heidegger wrote in German, but he wrote in a style and with a vocabulary that many German speakers, many native German speakers find completely baffling. He wrote in a particular idiosyncratic language, so it's difficult to read Heidegger. It's also difficult to try to get a hold of what an author means by secondary sources, and I've only given you a couple things. The Critchley article helps, but I'm not sure that it really gives us an answer to the question that I've asked you, and that is why does Heidegger characterize human existence as a being towards us? I suppose all we can really say are certain obvious things. Heidegger reminds us that we are temporal beings. That is, we are beings who live in time. We are spatial beings, obviously. Insofar as we have bodies, we are in a certain place and not in another place. As temporal beings, we are beings in time, and our lives unfold in time. And as Critchley said, time is finite. Now, what exactly that means, I suppose, it's finite as far as we're concerned. It's finite as far as our own horizon and our own perception, let's say, of time. Time is finite. Time is finite for us. And we have to acknowledge that we are moving in time towards the end of our personal, individual existence, at least our world, in the sense of our subjective world that we grasp is coming to an end. And I do think that Wally Shawn in the clip from My Dinner with Andre is quite helpful in this, is that we feel, he put it in a particularly dramatic way when he says if we were truly aware of ourselves and our being, let's say, we would feel that being every moment decaying towards death. Now that's a particularly interesting way of putting it. I don't know about decay, but I like it. And I think it expresses the fundamental ideas, at least as far as I grasp it, that the human being, what in German Heidegger called Dasein, I think it means being there. The human being exists as a temporal being moving into the future, and that future, the future is not an open-ended horizon. Its end will someday be reached. And why Heidegger thought this was an essential characteristic rather than a secondary characteristic of human existence, I would have to look deeper. But he does characterize our being itself as a being towards death, and that usually is discussed in connection with, let's say, the lesson of that. And the lesson of that is that unless we are aware of that finitude to our being, the fact that we are moving towards our end, towards our death, we cannot live completely truthful lives, that we are in some manner of denial unless we have truly assimilated that knowledge, truly acknowledged in a completely truthful way our mortality. The second question, what reasons does Landsberg provide for opposing Heidegger's view of death? I think that if we were to read all of Landsberg's essay, which is much more readable than Heidegger, we would get a better answer to that. But the excerpts that I've chosen, very brief excerpts, have all been chosen to emphasize what's going on in this question. Landsberg believes that, let's say that what Heidegger was doing was examining human existence. What are the essential characteristics of human existence? If we really study our mode of existence, let's say as human beings, what do we find? Landsberg thought that what he found was something quite different from what Heidegger found. What he found at the root of human existence was what he called an affirmation of the self. And that affirmation of the self was not just an earthly affirmation, I am and I will be, let's say that affirmation. It was an affirmation that extended beyond death. And one of the terms you'll see, again, this is translated actually from the French, but one of the terms you'll see in this excerpt is survival. And that, I think, is a good thing to keep in mind. And survival really means survival of death. So that Landsberg believes that it is fundamental to human existence that we have a demand or a hope, he calls it later, for the survival of death, for the continuation of the person beyond death. And that this crucially is not just a mere survival, just a mere continuation. It is also a fulfillment, which is, fundamentally a Christian idea. I'm sure it's shared in different forms with other religions. That is, that the afterlife is not for its own sake. The afterlife is not so I can live forever. That's quite important. The afterlife is so that I can be fulfilled. I think I've said this in the videos. So Landsberg thought that Heidegger fundamentally misread what it meant to be a person. Number 3, is Auden more congenial to Heidegger or Landsberg view of death? I chose him because I think he's more congenial to Landsberg, but it's a poem. There are different interpretations. What struck me about Auden's poem is that even though it doesn't come out and say it, it's about death. And maybe it does have both sides in it, both the Heidegger side and the Landsberg side. One of the lines is, our claim to own our bodies and our world is our catastrophe. That really sounds like a kind of an existentialist view. That is, we feel like we own this body and we own this world, but it'll all be taken away from us at death, right? So that's why it's our catastrophe. But then he goes on to say, what can we know but panic and caprice until we know our dreadful appetite demands a world that will be fluent satisfaction of our will. I think that at the end, he is talking about something very similar to Landsberg's idea of hope. The idea that this affirmation of the self and this demand for self-fulfillment is at the root of human existence. So I read Auden as being Landsbergian, let's say, but you may read him differently. So tough questions insofar as they are big, big questions, and are also questions that we would have to base on pretty limited reading of the sources, but that's what I had in mind.